Millionaire adopts a poor child on Christmas, but what he finds in her toy box changes everything. Alex Hartwell had everything money could buy, an empire built on ambition, a mansion that towered like a fortress, and a reputation envied by many. But behind the grandeur lay a man estranged from the warmth of family, living in a house that echoed with silence. It was Christmas, a season that once meant something, now reduced to a checklist of superficial gestures. This year, however, would be different. Not because Alex saw redemption. No, he wasn't the type to believe in second chances. This was about optics, a well-calculated move to soften his public image. And so, amidst the festive chaos of the season, Alex decided to adopt a child. That's how Emily Grace entered his life, a quiet girl with a gaze that seemed far too knowing for her years. She arrived with little more than the clothes on her back and a single, battered teddy bear she clung to like a lifeline. To Alex, she was a responsibility, a temporary project, maybe even a nuisance. But something about her lingered. It wasn't just her silence or the way she avoided the grandeur of his world. It was the bear, worn, tattered, and stitched with initials he didn't yet understand. The toy carried a significance that Alex couldn't ignore. And as Emily settled into his home, it became clear that what she carried with her wasn't just a toy. It was a secret, one that would challenge everything Alex thought he knew about himself and the life he had built. As snow began to fall outside the mansion's towering windows, Alex stared at a photograph from his past. A reminder of simpler times and the choices that had led him here. The child asleep upstairs, clutching that bear, was about to change everything. But Alex didn't know it yet. The morning light filtered through the towering glass windows of Alex Hartwell's mansion, casting an almost ethereal glow over the pristine, extravagant interior. Chandeliers hung like jeweled constellations above mahogany floors polished to perfection, reflecting the opulence of a life meticulously built on wealth. Yet amidst the grandeur, there was a pervasive silence that seemed to echo louder than any laughter or music ever could. Alex sat alone at his marble dining table, staring at an untouched plate of gourmet breakfast, his mind elsewhere. Christmas was only days away, but for him, the season had long lost its meaning. His employees bustled about, decorating the enormous mansion with wreaths, lights, and ornaments that glittered like gold. But none of it mattered to Alex. It was all for appearances, a performance for a life he barely cared for anymore. He picked up a framed photograph sitting on the table, an image from years ago when his ambitions were still fueled by a sense of purpose. The picture showed a younger Alex, standing beside his late parents in front of a modest home decorated with handmade Christmas ornaments. His mother's warm smile radiated through the image, while his father's protective stance reminded Alex of simpler times when joy wasn't tied to status or material possessions. He traced his finger along the glass, feeling the pang of longing for a life he had abandoned. A sharp knock on the door snapped him back to reality. His assistant, Eleanor Bishop, walked in, her demeanor professional yet warm, carrying a stack of neatly bound papers. "Sir, the adoption agency finalized the list. They're ready for your review," she said, placing the documents before him. Alex leaned back, the chair creaking slightly under his weight as he surveyed the papers. "It's a publicity move, Eleanor," he muttered. "Let's not romanticize this. It's just for the headlines." Eleanor, unflinching, replied with measured firmness, "Sometimes, sir, even the most calculated decisions can lead to unexpected outcomes." Her words hung in the air as Alex waved her off, unwilling to engage further. He didn't believe in the sentimentality of Christmas anymore, and adopting a child was merely a business strategy to soften his image in the public eye. Yet, as his gaze lingered on the photo, a flicker of something stirred within him, an almost imperceptible yearning for the connection he had lost. The drive to the adoption agency was uneventful, save for the occasional glance Alex stole at the snow-covered streets outside his car window. He noticed children playing, their laughter piercing through the cold. Their snowball fights a stark contrast to the somber monotony of his life. Arriving at the agency, He stepped into a modest building that felt worlds apart from his own lavish existence. The warmth inside was welcoming, and a faint scent of pine from a small Christmas tree in the corner reminded him of his childhood. Eleanor greeted the director and handled most of the formalities, leaving Alex to observe the photographs of children hanging on the walls. Each picture told a story, some of hope, others of struggle, but one, in particular, caught his attention. It was a picture of a young girl with auburn hair, her eyes wide with an innocence that seemed untouched by the hardships of life. Beneath her photo was a name, Emily Grace. Something about her gaze held Alex captive. There was a quiet strength in her expression, as if she had endured more than her years should allow, but still held on to hope. "She's an extraordinary child," the director began, noticing Alex's focus. "Emily lost her parents recently. She's resilient but guarded, a true survivor." Alex nodded curtly, dismissing the emotional weight of the statement. He couldn't afford to feel not now. "I'll meet her," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. The meeting room was sparse, with a few chairs and a table adorned with simple Christmas decorations. When Emily walked in, she clutched a small, worn-out teddy bear, its fur matted and one eye missing. Her gaze met Alex's briefly before she sat down, silent and cautious. "Hello, Emily," he said, his voice formal, almost detached. She didn't reply, instead hugging the bear tighter. "I'm Alex Hartwell," he continued, attempting to bridge the chasm between them. "I understand this is a big change for you." Still, she said nothing. Her silence wasn't defiance. It was protection, a shield against a world that had taken too much from her already. Eleanor stepped in, her softer approach drawing Emily out slightly. "That's a lovely bear you have there, Emily," she said with a kind smile. "Does it have a name?" Emily's grip loosened ever so slightly as she whispered, "Daniel. It was my daddy's." The words, though few, carried the weight of loss, and for the first time, Alex felt a pang of discomfort. Not for himself, but for her. He studied the bear and noticed initials stitched into the fabric. DG. He dismissed the detail as trivial, but it lingered in his mind. He quickly redirected the conversation, saying, "We'll ensure you're comfortable in your new home." Emily nodded silently, her expression unreadable. The ride back to the mansion was quiet. Emily sat in the back seat, gazing out the window while clutching Daniel, her world condensed into the small bear she refused to let go of. Alex stole glances at her through the rearview mirror, his mind racing with questions he didn't dare ask. Who was Daniel to her beyond a name? What had she endured to hold on to something so simple yet so significant? He shook his head, reminding himself that this wasn't about emotional involvement. It was a gesture, nothing more. But the bear and the name stitched on it refused to leave his thoughts. Arriving at the mansion, Alex instructed his staff to prepare a room for Emily, ensuring it was filled with everything a child might need. Yet, when Emily saw the luxurious space, her reaction was muted. She placed Daniel on the bed, her only possession amidst the overwhelming grandeur, and sat beside it, as if the room belonged to someone else entirely. Alex observed her from the doorway, a strange unease creeping into his chest. Eleanor appeared beside him and whispered, "Sometimes, what you give can never replace what they've lost." Alex didn't respond, but her words settled heavily on his mind. That night, as snow began to fall outside the mansion's grand windows, Alex found himself unable to sleep. The image of Emily clutching Daniel replayed in his thoughts, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt compelled to know more. It wasn't about the headlines anymore. It was about her. But he brushed the thought aside, retreating into the solitude he knew too well. In her room, Emily lay awake, her small frame dwarfed by the enormous bed. She whispered to Daniel, her words barely audible, "I miss you, Daddy." As the mansion fell silent, the first seeds of change were sown, though neither Alex nor Emily knew how profoundly their lives would intertwine. The days following Emily's arrival were a whirlwind of adjustments, though mostly for Alex, who found himself caught off guard by her quiet defiance. The grand mansion, with its golden staircases and vaulted ceilings, seemed to swallow her small figure whole. The staff had gone to great lengths to prepare her room. Plush bedding, rows of untouched toys, a Christmas tree glittering with ornaments, but none of it seemed to matter. Emily barely glanced at the opulence, retreating to a corner of her room with Daniel, the battered teddy bear she held like a lifeline. Alex observed her from the doorway, his expression unreadable as Eleanor approached. "She's not like most children," she said softly. "She doesn't need things. She needs time." At breakfast the next morning, Emily sat across from Alex at the long dining table. She nibbled on a piece of toast, her eyes downcast, while Alex studied her, searching for a way to bridge the silence between them. He cleared his throat. "Emily, is there something you'd like? Perhaps a new dress or another toy for Christmas?" Her eyes flickered up briefly before returning to her plate. "No, thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex frowned and used a rejection. He pressed on, gesturing to the towering Christmas tree in the living room visible from where they Saturday will have a grand celebration soon. There will be gifts, music, and "I don't want anything," she interrupted, clutching Daniel tighter. Her words were simple, but the finality in them left Alex momentarily speechless. Later that day, Alex found himself in his study, replaying the brief exchange in his mind. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them, as though she carried a weight far too heavy for someone her age. He reached for a glass of scotch, the amber liquid swirling as he stared into the fireplace. What was it about this child that unsettled him so deeply? She wasn't ungrateful, he realized. She was simply guarded, like someone who had learned the hard way not to expect too much from life. Eleanor entered, holding a small tray of correspondence, and hesitated at the sight of Alex's contemplative expression. "Sir," she began carefully, "perhaps she's not ready to open up. Loss has a way of silencing people." Determined to connect with her, Alex arranged an outing to the local Christmas market, hoping the festive atmosphere might lift her spirits. The streets were alive with twinkling lights, the scent of roasted chestnuts filling the crisp winter air. Children darted between stalls, their laughter ringing out like bells. But Emily remained quiet, her small hand loosely holding his. At one stall, Alex purchased a delicate snow globe and handed it to her, his smile almost tentative. "A little Christmas magic," he said, watching for her reaction. She stared at the globe, its miniature scene of a snowy village spinning with the shake of her hand, before placing it carefully back in the box. "Thank you," she said politely, but there was no spark of joy in her tone. The gesture, though well-intentioned, felt hollow. Back at the mansion, Alex tried again, this time enlisting Eleanor's help to decorate a smaller tree for Emily's room. The staff brought boxes of ornaments, their chatter filling the space as they strung lights and garlands. Emily watched from her seat by the window, Daniel perched on her lap. "Emily," Eleanor coaxed gently, holding out a glittering silver star. "Would you like to place this on top?" For a moment, it seemed she might agree, but then she shook her head, her grip on the teddy bear tightening. "No, thank you," she said again, her voice steady but distant. The staff exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed, while Alex stood by, feeling the sting of her withdrawal. The turning point came one evening when Alex found Emily sitting in the library, a massive room she had previously avoided. She was perched on an oversized armchair, flipping through a picture book she had found on one of the lower shelves. She didn't notice him at first, her focus entirely on the colorful illustrations of families gathered around fireplaces, their faces glowing with warmth. "Do you like that book?" he asked, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw a flicker of emotion, something between longing and sadness. "It's nice," she said simply, closing the book carefully and setting it aside. Alex hesitated before sitting across from her. "Emily, what do you miss the most?" The question was unexpected, and for a moment, she seemed unsure how to answer. Finally, she whispered, Christmas. With my daddy, her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. Alex felt a pang of guilt, though he couldn't place why. He leaned forward, his tone softening. "Your father must have been a good man," he said. Emily nodded, her fingers brushing against Daniel's worn fur. "He was," she murmured. "He gave me this bear. It's the only thing I have left of him." Alex studied the bear more closely, noting the initials embroidered on its foot. DG. He had seen them before but hadn't thought much of it. Now, they seemed to take on a weight of their own. DG, he repeated aloud, and Emily glanced at him, her expression guarded once more. "Daniel Grace," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. As the days passed, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the bear, and by extension Daniel, held a significance he hadn't yet uncovered. He found himself drawn to Emily's quiet resilience, her ability to hold on to hope despite everything she had lost. But even as he grew more invested, she remained an enigma, her trust something he had yet to earn. It frustrated him, though he didn't show it. Instead, he continued to observe her, each small interaction revealing a little more about the depth of her character. And yet, there was still so much he didn't know, so much he needed to understand if he was ever going to reach her. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Alex stood by the window, watching the flakes dance in the golden glow of the streetlights. Behind him, Emily sat in her usual spot by the fireplace, Daniel clutched in her arms. He turned to her, his voice breaking the silence. "Emily, if you could have anything for Christmas, anything at all, what would it be?" She looked up at him, her eyes searching us for a moment before she replied, "To see my daddy again." Her words, so simple yet so impossible, struck a chord deep within Alex. For the first time, he realized that no amount of wealth or generosity could ever replace what she had lost. That night, as Alex lay awake in his sprawling bedroom, he couldn't stop thinking about Emily's wish. It wasn't something he could grant, no matter how much power or money he wielded. And yet, there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, a sense that there was something he could do, something he hadn't yet figured out. The initials on the bear, the name Daniel Grace, and Emily's unwavering attachment to it all seemed to point to a deeper story, one that he was now determined to uncover. The days grew colder, and Christmas crept closer, but the warmth of the season seemed distant within the mansion's grand walls. Alex found himself increasingly drawn to Emily's quiet world, one where her every action seemed purposeful, even if guarded. The teddy bear, Daniel, remained her constant companion, a thread connecting her to a life Alex had yet to fully understand. One morning, as the snow fell gently outside, he found her in the library again, perched on the same oversized chair. She wasn't reading this time, just staring at the fireplace, her expression far away. "Emily," Alex began carefully, sitting in the chair opposite hers. "Tell me about your father." Her grip on the bear tightened, but she didn't look away from the flickering flames. "He was kind," she said after a pause. "He worked hard until he couldn't." Her words hung in the air, and Alex felt a strange pull to uncover more. "What did he do?" he asked gently. Emily glanced at him, her gaze cautious but steady. "He fixed things," she said simply. "He said every broken thing deserves a second chance." The words struck Alex unexpectedly, stirring a memory he couldn't quite place. He looked at the bear again, its matted fur and stitched initials. "DG," he murmured aloud, and Emily nodded. "Daniel Grace," she confirmed. Alex froze, the name sparking something deep within his mind. It was familiar, but he couldn't immediately place it. The initials, the name, and Emily's quiet resilience began to form a puzzle he hadn't realized he was trying to solve. Later that evening, Alex found himself in his study, combing through old business records. It had been years since he'd looked at these files, most of which chronicled employees who had come and gone during his rapid rise to success. As he flipped through the pages, a name caught his eye: Daniel Grace. His heart skipped a beat as he scanned the document, his breath catching when he reached the details of Daniel's dismissal. It had been swift and cold, a cost-cutting measure during a period of expansion. Alex remembered the meeting vividly now. Daniel had pleaded for his job, explaining that he had a family to support, but Alex hadn't listened. He had been too focused on the bottom line, too eager to prove himself. The memory hit him like a blow, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of regret. The next morning, Alex visited Eleanor in her office, the file on Daniel clutched tightly in his hand. "I need to know more about him," he said without preamble. Eleanor raised an eyebrow but took the file, skimming its contents. "Daniel Grace," she said thoughtfully. "I remember him. He was one of the most diligent workers we had. It was a shame how things ended." Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried a weight that made Alex wince. "Did you know he had a daughter?" he asked, his voice quieter. Eleanor nodded. He mentioned her once, said she was his reason for everything. The words made Alex's chest tighten, the connection between him and Emily growing clearer with each passing moment. Determined to understand more, Alex reached out to Maggie Turner, the social worker who had facilitated Emily's adoption. They met at a small cafe in the city, where the hum of conversation created a cocoon of anonymity. "I need to know about her father," Alex said as soon as they sat down. Maggie regarded him carefully before speaking. "Daniel Grace was a good man," she began. "He worked hard to provide for Emily, even after losing his job. But when he got sick, well, there wasn't much he could do." Her voice softened, her expression tinged with sadness. "He loved her fiercely, though. That bear she carries? It was his last gift to her before he passed." As Maggie spoke, Alex's mind raced. The bear, the initials, the memory of Daniel pleading for a chance. All of it collided in his thoughts, creating a picture that was both painful and clear. He had dismissed Daniel without a second thought, never considering the ripple effects of his actions. And now, years later, he had unwittingly become the guardian of the man's daughter. It was a twist of fate he couldn't ignore, and the weight of it pressed heavily on his chest. "Does she know?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie shook her head. "She doesn't know the details, just that her father worked for someone who couldn't help him when he needed it most." That night, back at the mansion, Alex stood in the doorway of Emily's room, watching as she arranged Daniel carefully on her pillow before climbing into bed. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though the bear held more than memories. It held her father's presence. Alex felt a lump rise in his throat, a sense of guilt mingled with a strange, protective resolve. He didn't know how to tell her the truth, but he knew he couldn't keep it from her forever. For now, he simply whispered, "Good night, Emily," before retreating to his own room, where sleep eluded him. As the days passed, Alex found himself drawn deeper into Emily's world. He noticed the way she spoke to Daniel when she thought no one was listening, her whispers carrying a mixture of sadness and hope. He saw the way she clung to small routines, finding comfort in the familiar amidst the vast unfamiliarity of her new home. And with each observation, his determination to make amends grew stronger. But the question remained, how? How could he possibly make up for a past mistake that had cost so much? One afternoon, as snowflakes began to blanket the grounds once more, Alex took Emily to the garden, hoping the fresh air might lift her spirits. They walked in silence for a while, their breaths visible in the cold air. "Emily," he said eventually, his tone hesitant, "do you ever think about what you want to be when you grow up?" She looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I want to help people," she said simply, "like my daddy did." Her words, so earnest and unassuming, struck Alex deeply. He realized then that Emily wasn't just her father's legacy. She was his redemption. That evening, Alex returned to his study, the file on Daniel still sitting on his desk. He opened it again, his eyes scanning the details he had missed before. Among the documents was a note Daniel had written during his final weeks at the company, a plea for reconsideration that had never reached Alex's desk. It was a simple letter, but its words carried the weight of a man's love for his family. Alex read it twice, then a third time, his vision blurring as guilt washed over him. He had failed Daniel once, but he couldn't fail Emily now. The realization ignited something within him, a determination not just to protect her, but to honor the man who had loved her more than anything. The study was cloaked in silence, save for the soft rustle of papers as Alex sifted through the remnants of Daniel Grace's life in the file before him. It had become a ritual over the past few days. Returning to this room late at night, the fire burning low, his thoughts consumed by questions about a man he had barely known yet profoundly wronged. Tonight, however, his gaze kept drifting to a small toy box Eleanor had left on the corner of his desk earlier that day. It held the few belongings Emily had brought with her: a photo, some crayons, and of course, the worn teddy bear Daniel. The sight of the bear seemed to call to him, its faded fur and stitched initials silently carrying the weight of Emily's world. Alex reached for the bear, turning it over in his hands. It was smaller than he'd realized, the kind of toy that might have once been vibrant and plush but had been loved into wear. His fingers brushed against the initials DG on its paw, a reminder of the man whose name now haunted him. As he examined it, his thumb caught on an uneven seam near its back. Frowning, he traced the stitching, realizing it wasn't just a sign of wear, it had been deliberately sewn shut. His curiosity deepened. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he pulled at the thread. The seam gave way, revealing a hidden pocket inside the bear. His breath hitched as he reached in and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. The note was yellowed with age, the handwriting slightly faded but still legible. Alex unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling as he read. To whoever finds this, please know this bear is more than a toy. It's a promise to my daughter Emily that she will always be loved, even when I'm not there to tell her. If you found this, I can only hope you'll take care of her and give her the life I couldn't. She deserves the world. The words hit Alex like a tidal wave, each sentence heavier than the last. He read it again, slower this time, his vision blurring with unshed tears. The simplicity of Daniel's love for his daughter was devastating. This wasn't just a note. It was a plea, a legacy carried by a small bear that had become Emily's lifeline. Alex leaned back in his chair, the note still clutched in his hand as he stared at the fire. He thought of Daniel standing in his office all those years ago, pleading for his job. He had been desperate, not for himself, but for the daughter who had meant everything to him. Alex had dismissed him with barely a thought, consumed by his own ambition and blind to the consequences. Now, the consequences were sitting at his breakfast table every morning, clutching this bear as though her life depended on it. Guilt clawed at his chest, raw and unrelenting. He had taken everything from Daniel, and in doing so, he had taken everything from Emily. The weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. By the time dawn broke, Alex had made his decision. The note, now carefully tucked back inside the bear, felt like a vow, a commitment to right the wrongs of the past. At breakfast, Emily sat across from him, her usual quiet demeanor unchanged. Alex placed the bear gently on the table between them, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "there's something I found that I think belongs to you." She tilted her head, her curiosity piqued but her caution intact. "What is it?" she asked. Alex pushed the bear toward her. "Inside, there's something your father left for you." Emily hesitated, her small hands reaching for the bear with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty. She found the loose seam quickly, her fingers nimble as she pulled out the carefully folded note. Alex watched as her eyes scanned the words, her lips moving slightly as she read. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she clutched the note tightly to her chest, her small frame trembling under the weight of its meaning. "He wrote this for me," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Alex nodded, his throat tight. "He did, and I found it because I needed to understand him, to understand you." The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Emily looked at Alex, her gaze piercing. "He always told me to be brave," she said softly. "That no matter what happened, I should always remember he loved me." Her words were simple but profound, and Alex felt his chest tighten again. "He did love you, Emily. More than anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I failed him. I failed you. But I'm going to do everything I can to make it right." Emily studied him for a long moment, her young eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said simply, "but you have to show me." That night, as Emily prepared for bed, Alex tucked her in for the first time. The bear, now whole again, rested beside her on the pillow. "Good night, Emily," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with unspoken emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a cautious but growing trust. "Good night, Alex," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. As he left her room, Alex felt a shift within himself, a sense that this was just the beginning. The note had shattered his past, but it had also given him a chance to rebuild. And this time he wouldn't fail. The morning after their conversation, the atmosphere in the mansion was heavier, though not in a way Alex could fully define. Emily was quieter than usual, though she still carried herself with the same careful precision. At breakfast, she sat across from Alex, her small hands resting on the table, the note from Daniel folded neatly beside her plate. She didn't speak until Eleanor entered, placing a glass of orange juice in front of her. "Thank you," Emily murmured, her eyes not lifting from the paper. Alex tried to break the silence, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Emily, I meant what I said last night. I'll show you I can do better." Her gaze flickered up to meet his, and though she nodded, her expression remained guarded. It was clear that while she heard his words, she wasn't ready to fully believe them. Alex spent the day consumed by the thought of how he could begin to repair the damage he had caused, not just to Daniel, but to Emily as well. The weight of her trust, or lack thereof, felt heavier than any boardroom deal he had ever faced. He retreated to his study, surrounded by ledgers, legal documents, and memories he had tried to forget. The file on Daniel Grace lay open on his desk, its contents now burned into his mind. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he said, his tone softer than usual. Eleanor stepped inside, her usual professionalism replaced by something gentler. "Sir, she's in the library," she said. "I think she might be ready to talk." Alex hesitated for a moment before rising, his heart pounding as he made his way to the library. Emily was sitting in the same oversized chair, Daniel in her lap as always. When Alex entered, she glanced up briefly before returning her attention to the book she was holding. "Emily," he began, his voice careful, "I've been thinking about what you said, about showing you, not just saying it." She didn't respond immediately, but he could see the way her hands tightened slightly on Daniel's paw. Taking a deep breath, Alex sat down across from her. "I've started something," he said. "Something I hope will show you how much your father's life meant, and how much you mean to me now." Her eyes finally met his, curiosity flickering in their depths, though she remained silent. Alex explained his plan carefully, choosing his words with precision. He had decided to establish a foundation in Daniel's name, one that would provide support and opportunities for families like theirs. People who had been let down by systems, by circumstances, or by men like him. "It's not enough to make up for what I did," he admitted, his voice faltering slightly. "But it's a start, and it's a way to honor your father's legacy." Emily listened intently, her small face unreadable as he spoke. When he finished, there was a long pause. "Do you think he'd be proud of that?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but steady. The question caught Alex off guard, but he nodded. "I hope so," he said. "I want him to be." The following days were filled with preparation. Alex threw himself into the logistics of the foundation, working late into the night with Eleanor and a team of advisors to bring his vision to life. He kept Emily involved as much as possible, asking her opinion on details large and small. Though she still carried an air of caution, there were moments when he caught glimpses of a lighter side, when she smiled softly or spoke about her father with warmth. It was in these moments that Alex felt hope, a tentative but growing belief that he could rebuild the trust he had broken. Yet, the journey was far from easy, and doubt lingered in the back of his mind, whispering that his efforts might never be enough. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Emily surprised him by asking a question he hadn't expected. "What was my daddy like when you knew him?" she asked, her voice tinged with a curiosity that seemed almost hesitant. Alex leaned back in his chair, his expression softening as he considered his answer. "He was dedicated," he said. "He cared deeply about his work and about doing things right. But more than that, it was clear he cared about his family. He talked about you a lot. Even back then." Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile, though it quickly faded. "Did you like him?" she asked. Alex hesitated, the truth catching in his throat. "I didn't appreciate him as I should have," he admitted. "But looking back now, I can see how remarkable he was." The library grew quiet again, the only sound the crackling of the fire as Emily processed his words. She looked down at Daniel, her fingers brushing over the worn fabric. "He always said people deserve a second chance," she murmured, almost to herself. Alex leaned forward, his voice soft. "Do you think he would give me one?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something that resembled trust. "Maybe," she said, "but only if you earn it." The challenge was clear, but so was the possibility, and Alex felt a renewed determination settle within him. This wasn't just about fixing the past. It was about building a future where Emily could finally feel safe and loved. As Christmas Eve approached, the mansion began to feel less like a hollow shell and more like a home. Emily had slowly started to engage with the preparations, helping Eleanor and the staff decorate the tree in the living room. Alex watched from a distance, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and hope. He had spent so many years chasing success, but for the first time, he realized that the most meaningful achievements weren't measured in wealth or accolades. They were measured in moments like this, moments where connection, trust, and love began to grow. He still had a long way to go, but as he watched Emily place a small star on the tree's highest branch, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. That night, as Emily prepared for bed, Alex tucked her in for the first time. It was a simple gesture, one he hadn't thought much about before, but it felt significant now. "Good night, Emily," he said softly, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of emotions he couldn't fully decipher. "Good night, Alex," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. As he left her room, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time, he felt like he was beginning to earn the second chance her father had so selflessly spoken of. Christmas morning dawned quietly over the mansion, the snow outside forming a soft, pristine blanket over the grounds. Inside, the once silent halls were alive with a warmth that had long been absent. Alex stood by the grand staircase, watching as the staff bustled about, setting the final touches for the day's celebration. The tree in the living room glowed with soft lights, its base surrounded by carefully wrapped gifts. Yet it wasn't the grandeur of the decorations or the anticipation of the day that filled Alex with a sense of peace. It was the sight of Emily, her small frame standing near the tree, gazing at the ornaments she had helped hang. For the first time since her arrival, there was a softness to her expression, a glimmer of something that resembled joy. Eleanor approached, her usual composed demeanor softened by the festive atmosphere. "The foundation announcement is ready whenever you are," she said quietly. Alex nodded, his gaze still fixed on Emily. "Let's wait until after the presents," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "This morning is about her." Eleanor smiled, her approval evident, before stepping away to oversee the final preparations. As Alex made his way to the living room, Emily turned to him, clutching Daniel as always. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. Alex crouched down to her level, his smile genuine. "Good morning, Emily. Are you ready to see what Santa left for you?" Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of childlike curiosity breaking through her usual composure. They sat by the tree together, Alex handing her one carefully chosen gift at a time. Each package revealed something thoughtful: a small set of paints, a book about stars and constellations, and finally, a hand-knitted scarf in her favorite shade of blue. Emily's reactions were subtle but sincere, her quiet thank you after each gift filled with genuine gratitude. The final gift, however, was different. Alex handed her a small, plain box, his expression almost nervous. Emily tilted her head curiously as she opened it, revealing a delicate silver bracelet engraved with the initials DG. "It's from your father's foundation," Alex explained softly, "to remind you that everything we're doing now is because of him. And for you," Emily's fingers traced the engraving, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. After the presents, Alex gathered the staff and a few invited guests in the library for the Foundation's official announcement. Emily stood by his side, her presence a quiet but powerful testament to the journey they had both undergone. Alex spoke with a sincerity that surprised even himself, his words carrying the weight of his transformation. "This foundation is not just a tribute to Daniel Grace," he began, his gaze briefly meeting Emily's. "It's a commitment to honor the values he stood for, to provide opportunities for families like his, and to ensure that no one else feels as helpless as he must have." There was a pause as his voice faltered slightly, but he steadied himself, continuing, "This is my second chance, and I intend to make the most of it." The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt, but it was the look on Emily's face that mattered most to Alex. She didn't say much, but the way she reached for his hand spoke volumes. Together, they watched as Eleanor and Maggie took over the logistics, the details of the Foundation's operations already in motion. For Alex, it wasn't just about the Foundation. It was about showing Emily that he was willing to put in the work, that he was truly committed to earning the trust she had tentatively begun to offer. Later that afternoon, as the guests filtered out and the staff returned to their duties, Alex and Emily found themselves alone in the living room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room as they sat together on the couch. "Do you think my daddy knows about this?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. Alex glanced at her, his heart tightening at the question. "I think he does," he said honestly. "And I think he's proud of you, of us." She nodded slowly, her gaze returning to the bracelet on her wrist. "I hope so," she murmured. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding. It was Emily who broke the quiet, her voice carrying a hint of something Alex hadn't heard before. "Hope. Thank you, Alex, for everything." He looked at her, his smile soft but filled with emotion. "No, Emily. Thank you for giving me a chance." As evening fell, the mansion seemed to glow with a warmth that extended beyond its walls. The staff gathered in the dining hall for a simple but heartfelt Christmas dinner, with Emily and Alex seated at the head of the table. The room was filled with laughter and stories, a stark contrast to the cold silence that had once defined the space. Emily, though still reserved, participated more than Alex had ever seen, her quiet responses and occasional smiles lighting up the room in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was in these moments that Alex realized just how much had changed, not just for Emily but for himself as well. The man who had once measured his worth by his wealth now found his greatest joy in the connections he was building. As the night came to a close, Alex and Emily returned to the living room, where the tree stood tall and radiant. They sat together by the fire, Daniel resting comfortably on Emily's lap. "What was Christmas like when you were little?" Emily asked, her voice curious. Alex chuckled softly, the question taking him by surprise. "Simpler," he admitted, "but also warmer. My parents didn't have much, but they made sure I always felt loved." Emily nodded, her fingers brushing over Daniel's fur. "My daddy did that too," she said. Alex placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light but steady. "And now it's my turn," he said quietly, "to make sure you feel that too." As the final embers of the fire burned low, Alex watched as Emily's eyes grew heavy with sleep. He carried her to her room, tucking her in with a gentleness that felt natural now. Daniel was placed carefully beside her, and as he turned to leave, her small voice stopped him. "Good night, Alex," she murmured, her tone filled with a trust that had once seemed impossible. "Good night, Emily," he replied, his voice steady but thick with emotion. As he closed the door, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. This wasn't just a Christmas miracle. It was the start of a life he had never dared to imagine. A life filled with love, redemption, and the quiet strength of a second chance.